A woman's worth in the Arizona Territory wasn't measured in gold, but in her obedience. For Eliza Jane Abernathy, obedience was a currency she couldn't afford. Her crime wasn't theft or murder. It was the simple, defiant act of wearing denim trousers. For this, she was put on an auction block, a spectacle of shame for the grimy prospectors and settlers of Redemption Gulch. As the auctioneer prepared to sell her into servitude, a voice cold as a desert night cut through the crowd. He was a man who belonged to the canyons and the mesas, a rich Apache warrior, feared and respected in equal measure. And what he said next would ignite a fire that threatened to burn the whole town to the ground. The sun over Redemption Gulch was a merciless hammer, beating down on the parched earth until it cracked like old leather. For Eliza Jane Abernathy, the heat was just another layer of her personal hell. It clung to the back of her neck, dampened the cotton shirt she wore, and baked the worn denim of her trousers until they felt stiff as board. It was these trousers, a man's garment of coarse, practical denim, that had sealed her fate. She stood on the crude wooden porch of the Dust Devil Saloon, her chin held high, though a tremor ran through her legs. Before her, a crowd of 100 souls prospectors, with sun-scorched faces, tired-looking women in their bonnets and calico dresses, and aimless drifters smelling of cheap whiskey and desperation had gathered for the spectacle. The man at her side, the architect of her humiliation, was Jedediah Thorne. He was a corpulent man whose fine waistcoat was perpetually stained with sweat and gravy. His small piggy eyes, buried in fleshy sockets, gleamed with a proprietary malice as he surveyed his audience. "Behold, gentlemen." Thorne's voice boomed a theatrical roar that carried across the dusty thoroughfare. A cautionary tale, a woman who forgets her station, a woman who presumes to wear the attire of a man, work like a man, and speak her mind like a man. A smattering of jeers and nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Eliza flinched, but did not lower her gaze. She kept her eyes fixed on the distant, shimmering outline of the Dragoon Mountains, the same mountains she and her younger brother Thomas had crossed to get to this God-forsaken town. They had arrived with little more than a lame mule and a desperate hope of finding work so she could afford the doctor for Thomas's racking cough, a cough that sounded wetter and deeper with each passing week. Work she had found mucking out Thorne's stables and hauling barrels of ale. It was back-breaking labor, unfit for the long, cumbersome skirts society demanded of her. Skirts snagged on splinters, tripped her on uneven ground, and soaked up mud and filth, so she'd traded the last of her mother's silver lockets for a pair of worn denim trousers from a kind-faced tailor in a town 2 days east. They were freedom. They were practical. And in Redemption Gulch they were a declaration of war. Thorne had warned her. "Decent folk don't take kindly to abominations, girl." He had sneered just last week, his breath foul. "You'll wear a dress, or you'll find yourself without a roof over your head, or medicine for that sickly whelp of a brother." Eliza had refused. The $5 a week Thorne paid her barely covered the rent on their miserable shack, and the watered-down laudanum the town doctor, a man named Alistair Finch, prescribed for Thomas. She couldn't afford a dress, and she wouldn't have worn one for this work anyway. Her defiance had festered in Thorne's gut like a sour meal. The final straw had come that morning, when she had calmly and coolly corrected his math in front of a traveling merchant, saving the man $1 and costing Thorne a dishonest profit. His rage had been volcanic. "You owe me, girl," he had seethed, grabbing her arm. $50 for your brother's medicine, which I graciously covered. $20 for your board. You'll work it off. But first, this town will have a lesson in propriety. And so here she was. Not being sold into slavery, even Thorne wasn't brazen enough for that. but into indentured servitude. Her labor, her time, her very presence was being auctioned off to the highest bidder to cover a debt he had inflated to an impossible sum. The public shaming was the salt in the wound, his personal touch. "What am I bid for 1 year's service of this trousered Jezebel?" Thorne bellowed. "She's strong, I'll give her that. Strong-willed, too. Perhaps one of you fine gentlemen can break her of these unladylike notions." The men shifted, some looking away in shame, others grinning with predatory interest. A grubby miner named Peterson, known for his foul temper and fouler smell, raised a hand. "I'll bid $10. Thorne could use someone to shovel out my sluice box." "15, shouted another man from the back, a blacksmith's assistant with arms like tree trunks. Eliza felt a cold dread wash over her, a cold that had nothing to do with the oppressive heat. She was being traded like livestock. Her gaze swept the crowd, searching for a single spark of compassion, and found none. They were vultures, all of them. Then she saw him. He was standing near the back by the watering trough, apart from the rest. He hadn't been there a moment before, or if he had, he was the sort of man who could choose when he wanted to be seen. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his posture radiating a stillness that was more intimidating than any overt threat. He wasn't a white man. His skin was the color of rich copper. His straight, jet-black hair was tied back with a simple leather cord, and his high cheekbones and aquiline nose spoke of the Apache people who called these lands home long before towns like Redemption Gulch scarred the landscape. But he was dressed unlike any native she had ever seen. He wore tailored black trousers, not buckskin, and a clean, collarless white shirt under a fine leather vest. High-quality polished boots were on his feet. There was an unmistakable air of wealth about him, but it was a different kind of wealth from Thorne's ostentatious gold watch chain. It was the wealth of quiet, absolute confidence. His eyes, dark and piercing, were fixed not on Thorne, but directly on her. In them she saw no pity and no lust. She saw a flicker of something else, something she couldn't name, a kind of focused, intelligent assessment. $20? Peterson yelled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. Thorne's grin widened. $20 from Mr. Peterson. A fine price for a year of hard labor. Going once. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. Peterson's claim was a hovel on the edge of a canyon, and his cruelty to his mules was legendary. A year with him would be a death sentence one way or another. Going twice. She closed her eyes, bracing for the final fall of the invisible gavel. $1,000. The voice was not loud, but it possessed a resonant clarity that cut through the noise of the crowd like a razor. It had come from the man by the trough. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Heads whipped around to stare at him. Even Jedediah Thorne was stunned into silence, his mouth hanging agape. The Apache warrior pushed himself off the post he was leaning against and began to walk forward. The crowd parted for him as if he were a phantom, a silent, powerful wave of intimidation preceding him. He stopped 10 feet from the porch, his dark eyes never leaving Eliza's. Thorne finally found his voice, sputtering. 1,000. That's an absurd sum. For what her debt is only $70. The warrior's gaze flickered to Thorne, and for the first time, Eliza saw the cold fire in his eyes. It was an ancient, dangerous fire. "I am not paying her debt," he said, his voice level and devoid of emotion. "I am buying the contract. I am buying her indenture. And I am paying a price so high that no man in this town will ever again think a woman's freedom is a cheap commodity to be traded for the crime of wearing sensible clothes." He reached into a leather satchel at his hip and produced a small, heavy pouch. He tossed it onto the porch. It landed with a solid, definitive thud of gold coins. Thorne stared at it, as if it were a coiled serpent. Peterson the miner scoffed, emboldened by disbelief. "What's a savage like you want with a white woman anyway? You ain't even got the right." The warrior's head snapped toward Peterson. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "She will not be my servant," he stated, his eyes boring into the miner until the man physically recoiled. He then turned his gaze back to Eliza, a gaze that held the weight of the mountains behind him. "She can wear what she wants with me." The silence that fell over the main street of Redemption Gulch was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, broken only by the buzzing of flies and the distant rhythmic clang of a hammer from the blacksmith's forge. Jedediah Thorne stared at the pouch of gold, his greed warring with his shock and a deep, instinctual fear of the man standing before him. The people in the crowd were frozen, their faces a mixture of awe, suspicion, and outrage. A white woman, even a troublesome one, being bought by an Apache was a violation of the unwritten laws that governed their harsh world. Eliza's own mind was a whirlwind of confusion. $1,000. It was a fortune, more money than she had ever imagined in one place. It was enough to get Thomas to a real doctor in Tucson or even as far as California. It was enough to start a new life, a life far away from the dust and despair of this town. But it came from a man who was a complete stranger, a man from a world she had been taught to fear. She looked from the gold on the dusty planks to the warrior's impassive face. Who was he? What did he truly want? Thorne, ever the opportunist, was the first to recover. His fear was quickly being shouldered aside by the sheer intoxicating weight of the gold. He licked his lips and stooped his portly form, grunting with the effort to snatch the pouch. He loosened the drawstring and peered inside. His eyes widened. It was all there, eagles and double eagles, shining and pure. The contract is yours." Thorne stammered, his voice thick with avarice. He wouldn't meet the warrior's eyes. He looked at the gold, then at the crowd, as if seeking their approval for this bizarre transaction. 1 year's indenture, paid in full. The warrior gave a curt, dismissive nod. He did not spare Thorne another glance. His entire focus was now on Eliza. He took another step forward, stopping at the edge of the porch, looking up at her. He was closer now, and she could see the faint, silvery trace of an old scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a testament to a life of conflict she could barely comprehend. "Come down," he said. It was not a request. It was a simple statement of fact, a declaration that the previous chapter of her life had ended and a new one was beginning, whether she was ready or not. Eliza hesitated. Her feet felt rooted to the wood. To step off this porch was to step into an unknown far more terrifying than a year of labor for a brute like Peterson. At least that was a devil she knew. This man was a mystery wrapped in power and shadow. He saw the hesitation in her eyes, the flicker of fear. A subtle shift occurred in his expression, a slight softening of his stoic mask. "You are not my prisoner," he said, his voice lower, now meant for her alone. "Jedediah Thorne sold a contract for your labor. I have purchased it. You will work for me to honor it. That is all." Work for him. Doing what? Where the questions swirled in her head, but she couldn't voice them. The stares of the townspeople were like physical blows. She could feel their judgment, their condemnation. In their eyes, she was now the property of a savage, a woman who had fallen as low as one could fall. Gathering the tattered remnants of her dignity, she took a deep breath. She had been publicly shamed, her freedom bartered away like a sack of flour. Whatever lay ahead could not be worse than the slow death of spirit she was suffering here. She took one last look at the hostile faces in the crowd, then met the warrior's steady gaze. She nodded once, a sharp, defiant gesture. She walked to the edge of the porch and, ignoring Thorn, completely stepped down into the dust. She stood before her rescuer, her back straight, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had to tilt her head back to look up at him. "My brother," she said, her voice hoarse but clear. "Thomas. He is sick. I cannot leave without him." The warrior's expression didn't change, but he gave a single assenting nod. "I know. The boy with the lung fever in the shack by the dried creek bed. He will come with us." How did he know that? The question startled her. Had he been watching her, investigating her? The thought sent a fresh chill down her spine. This was no random act of chivalry. This was a calculated move by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Without another word, he turned and began to walk away, expecting her to follow. After a moment's hesitation, she did her dusty boots, scuffing in the dirt. The crowd parted for them again, a sea of silent, staring faces. She could hear them begin to whisper as soon as they had passed the sound like the rustling of dry leaves. "Can't believe it. Thorn just sold her. To Kyle de la Cruz." The name sent a jolt through her. Kyle de la Cruz. She had heard that name before, spoken in hushed, fearful tones around campfires and in the corners of the saloon. He wasn't just any Apache. He was a myth, a legend. Some said his mother was a wealthy Spanish captive, and his father a great Chiricahua chief, and that he had inherited the cunning of both. They said he owned a vast hidden ranch in the canyons, that he traded silver from secret mines, and that his herds of horses were the finest in the territory. They also said he was ruthless, that he dealt with his enemies swiftly and silently, and that the U.S. Army and the Mexican rurales alike left him well alone. He was a man who walked between worlds belonging to neither and respected by both out of fear. This was the man who now owned her contract. He led her to a pair of horses tied in the shade of the livery. They were magnificent animals, far superior to the broken-down nags, common in Redemption Gulch. One was a powerful black stallion with intelligent eyes, the other a calmer-looking chestnut mare. Kyle moved with an easy, fluid grace, untying the stallion's reins. He looked at her. "Can you ride?" "Yes," she answered simply. She had practically grown up on horseback before her family lost their farm. He nodded, gesturing to the mare. Eliza swung herself into the saddle, grateful that her trousers allowed her to mount with ease instead of the awkward side-saddle struggle a dress would have required. The irony was not lost on her. The very thing that had caused her condemnation was now her only practical asset. Kyle mounted his stallion in a single effortless motion. He looked back at her shack, a dilapidated structure of warped wood and patched canvas at the miserable edge of town. "Go and get your brother," he said. "Gather only what is necessary. I will wait." Eliza spurred the mare into a walk, her mind reeling. As she rode toward the shack where Thomas lay, weak and feverish, she glanced back. Kyle de la Cruz sat motionless on his stallion, a solitary, powerful figure silhouetted against the brutal afternoon sun. He wasn't watching her. He was watching the town, his hand resting lightly on the stock of a rifle in his saddle scabbard. He was a guardian, a predator, a king in his own domain. And she, Eliza Jane Abernathy, had just become a subject in his kingdom. She had been saved from the fire, but she had a terrifying feeling she had just landed in the heart of a volcano. The journey away from Redemption Gulch was a silent one. Eliza rode beside Cale with Thomas wrapped in their only good blanket, seated in front of her on the gentle mare. The boy was frighteningly light, his small body racked with coughing fits that seemed to shake his very bones. Each cough sent a fresh wave of panic through Eliza, but she kept her face a stony mask, refusing to show any weakness in front of the man who now controlled her fate. Kyle led them not toward the established trails, but east directly into the labyrinthine maze of canyons and rock formations that other travelers avoided. He moved with an unerring certainty, navigating the treacherous terrain as if it were a familiar room in his own home. He said nothing, his focus entirely on the path ahead, but Eliza felt his awareness of her, of Thomas, of every sound and shadow around them. It was an unnerving, palpable presence. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the towering rock walls in shades of orange and violet, the air grew cooler. Kyle finally drew his stallion to a halt in a small, sheltered box canyon. A spring trickled from a fissure in the rock, feeding a pool of crystal-clear water and nurturing a patch of green grass. It was a hidden oasis in the middle of the arid wilderness. "We will rest here for the night," he announced, dismounting. He moved to her horse, and without asking permission, gently lifted the frail form of her brother from her arms. Thomas, weak with fever, barely stirred. Kyle carried him to a soft patch of grass near the spring and laid him down as carefully as if he were handling fine porcelain. Eliza watched a knot of conflicting emotions in her chest. His gentle handling of her brother was at odds with the dangerous reputation that preceded him. He was a puzzle, and she didn't have any of the pieces. She dismounted, her own muscles aching from the ride. Kyle was already building a small, smokeless fire with an efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. He seemed to conjure dry twigs and kindling from the barren ground. Within minutes, a small, warm fire crackled to life. "There is dried meat and corn cakes in my saddlebag," he said, gesturing with his chin. "Feed your brother if he can eat, then yourself." Eliza did as she was told, feeling more like an employee than a captive. She managed to get Thomas to swallow a few sips of water and a small piece of a soft corn cake. He soon drifted back into a fitful, feverish sleep. Eliza ate her own portion, the dried meat tough but nourishing. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and Thomas's ragged breathing. Finally, she could bear it no longer. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Why did you do it? $1,000 is a fortune. You could have bought a herd of cattle for that price. You could have bought half of Redemption Gulch." Kyle looked up from the fire, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. He considered her question for a long moment before answering. "Cattle die. Land can be stolen. A town like yours is built on greed and will eventually eat itself. None of those things are a good investment." "And I am—" The question was sharp, tinged with sarcasm. "I did not buy you Eliza Jane Abernathy." He corrected her, his tone even. "I bought your contract. There is a difference. I saw a woman being punished for her strength, not her weakness. Thorn and men like him fear that. They seek to crush it because they cannot possess it. I do not fear it. I respect it." His words stunned her. He spoke of respect, a concept she had rarely encountered from any man. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he replied. "I know you work from sunup to sundown to care for your brother. I know you face down men like Thorn without flinching. I know you chose practicality over convention, even when it made you an outcast. In the land where I was raised, these are virtues. In your world, it seems they are crimes for a woman to possess." He paused, poking the fire with a stick. "As for the money, let us just say I have a grievance with men who believe they can put a price on a person's spirit." His answer was more than she had expected, and it left her with even more questions. Before she could ask them, he rose to his feet. "Get some sleep," he said. "We have a long ride tomorrow." He took a blanket from his own bedroll and laid it over the sleeping form of her brother before walking to the edge of the canyon. He stood watch, a solitary figure, against the star-dusted sky, leaving Eliza alone with her thoughts and the flickering fire. They rode for another full day, deeper into the rugged country. Just as Eliza began to believe they would wander the wilderness forever, the landscape changed. The narrow canyon they were following opened into a wide, verdant valley she never would have believed existed. A clear, fast-running river snaked through its center, lined with cottonwood trees. Herds of healthy-looking horses grazed on lush grass, and in the distance she could see irrigated fields of corn and squash. At the heart of the valley, nestled against the protective embrace of a sheer cliff face, was a sprawling ranch house. It was a remarkable structure, built not of rough timber, but of adobe and dark, sturdy wood, with a low-pitched roof and a wide, shaded veranda. It was a seamless blend of Spanish and native design, a fortress, and a home all in one. This was Kyle de la Cruz's domain. It was his kingdom, hidden from the world. As they approached, several men emerged from a large barn. They were Apache like Kale, but dressed in a mixture of traditional buckskin and practical denim. They moved with a quiet purpose, taking the horses without a word, their expressions revealing nothing as they glanced at Eliza. One older man with a kind, weathered face, whom Kale called Chayton, came forward. "The boy is sick," Kyle said to him in a low voice. Chayton nodded, his gaze falling on Thomas. He looked at Eliza with eyes that held a deep, ancient wisdom. "We will take him to the east room. It is warm and the morning sun is gentle there. My wife Narlin is skilled with herbs." Two men carefully lifted Thomas onto a makeshift stretcher and carried him inside the main house. Eliza started to follow her heart, pounding with anxiety, but Kyle placed a hand gently on her arm. "Let them work," he said. "Narlin knows the old ways. She can help him more than the whiskey doctor in town ever could. Come." He led her not into the main house, but to a smaller, separate cabin, a short distance away. It was simple, but impeccably clean, with a sturdy bed, a small table, a stone fireplace, and a window that looked out over the entire valley. A clean cotton dress and a pair of softer leather moccasins were laid out on the bed. "This will be your home," he said, standing in the doorway. "You are not a prisoner here. You may come and go as you please within the valley. Your work to satisfy the terms of the contract will be to assist Nalin in caring for your brother. When he is well, we will discuss a new arrangement." He paused, his eyes falling on the dress. "The clothes are a gift. Wear them if you wish, or do not. It is your choice." He turned to leave. "Kyle!" she called out, stopping him. He turned back, his expression unreadable. "Thank you." She said the words, feeling small and inadequate. He simply nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than usual. "Rest, Eliza, Jane," he said. And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the quiet cabin, in a world she didn't understand, under the protection of a man who was more myth than mortal. As she looked out the window at the impossible, beautiful valley, she realized she had been freed from one cage, only to be placed in another, a much larger, more comfortable one, but a cage nonetheless, built by a man whose true motives remained a dangerous, compelling mystery. The days that followed blurred into a routine of cautious hope. Eliza spent most of her time in the east room of the main house, a warm, airy space that smelled of cedar and drying herbs. Narlin Chayton's wife was a small, serene woman with hands that were never still. She moved with a quiet grace, brewing teas from willow bark to combat Thomas's fever, and creating poultices of mullein and other plants Eliza had never seen to ease the congestion in his chest. Nalin spoke little English, and Eliza knew no Apache, but they developed their own language of gestures and shared glances. Eliza learned to grind herbs with a stone pestle to keep the compresses on Thomas's forehead cool and to coax nourishing broths between his pale lips. For the first time in months, Thomas's fever seemed to lessen its grip. The deep rattling cough softened, and he began to sleep for long, peaceful stretches. The change was slow, almost imperceptible day to day, but it was there. A fragile seed of hope began to take root in Eliza's weary heart. Kyle kept his distance. She would see him in the evenings, standing on the veranda of the main house, looking out over the valley as the sun set. He ran his ranch with a quiet authority, his men moving with a loyalty and efficiency that spoke of deep respect. He was a paradox, a man of the earth who read from leather-bound books in a lamplit study, a warrior who managed complex irrigation systems and horse bloodlines with the acumen of a seasoned businessman. One evening, as Eliza sat by her brother's bedside, Kyle appeared in the doorway. He held 2 cups of steaming tea. He wordlessly handed one to her and took a seat in a chair across the room, watching Thomas sleep. "Nellin says the fever has broken," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "She believes he will recover." Tears pricked Eliza's eyes, and she quickly blinked them away, taking a sip of the minty tea. I don't know how to repay you." "Your brother's health is not part of your contract," he replied, his gaze fixed on the sleeping boy. "It is a simple matter of decency, a concept Thorn and his kind have forgotten." They sat in a comfortable silence for a time. The protective walls Eliza had built around herself were beginning to crack. This man had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. She found herself wanting to understand the man behind the myth. "The name they called you in town," she began, her voice tentative. "Kyle de la Cruz. It's not an Apache name." He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "My father was a Chiricahua war chief. My mother was born to a wealthy family in Sonora. She was taken in a raid when she was a girl not much older than you are now." He spoke of it as a simple fact, but Eliza could hear the lifetime of stories contained in that single statement. "She learned the ways of my father's people," he continued, his eyes distant. "She became his wife, his advisor. She was fierce and intelligent. She taught me her language, her numbers, how to read from her books. My father taught me the ways of the land, how to hunt, how to fight, how to survive. De la Cruz was her name. I use it when I deal with your world. It makes them more comfortable." A faint ironic smile touched his lips, or at least it confuses them enough that they leave me alone. "What happened to her?" Eliza asked softly. The smile vanished. He turned his head and looked at the scar on his own face, visible in the lamplight. "When I was a boy, a patrol of Mexican soldiers, irregulars, bounty hunters, really tracked our band. They were not looking for warriors. They were looking for captives to sell. They attacked our winter camp. My father and many warriors were away on a hunt." His voice became flat, devoid of all emotion. "My mother fought to protect me and the other children. She was as brave as any warrior I have ever known. That is how I received this." He touched his scar. "It is the last gift she ever gave me. A reminder." "A reminder of what?" Eliza whispered. "That there are 2 kinds of laws," he said, his dark eyes meeting hers. "The laws men write in books to serve their own interests, and the laws of survival and honor that are written on the heart. I trust only the second." In that moment she understood. She understood his intervention in Redemption Gulch, his contempt for Thorn, his respect for her own defiance. He had seen a reflection of his mother's spirit in her, the same refusal to be broken by a world that sought to put her in a cage. Her wearing pants was not the issue. It was a symbol of the same unbreakable will that had led his mother to fight to the death for her son. A new, deeper connection formed between them in the quiet of that sick room, a bond forged in shared pain and a mutual understanding of what it meant to fight against the world. But peace in the valley was a fragile thing. A few days later, Chaitan returned from a rare trading trip to a town south of Redemption Gulch. His face was grim as he spoke with Kyle on the veranda. Eliza, standing in the doorway of her cabin, could not hear the words, but she could see the tension in Kyle's shoulders, the hard set of his jaw. Later that evening he came to her cabin. The sun had set and the air was cool. "There is trouble," he said, without preamble. "Jedediah Thorn is not a man who forgives a public humiliation. He has been spreading poison in Redemption Gulch. He is telling people that I didn't buy your contract, but that I abducted you. He says a savage has stolen a white woman and that I am a threat to the good people of the territory." Eliza's blood ran cold. "They can't believe that the whole town saw you pay him. Memory is a fickle thing when fear and hatred are involved," Kyle said grimly. "Thorn has friends, men who profit from his corruption. He has gone to the territorial marshal in Prescott. He has twisted the story, painted himself as the victim and me as the villain. He is trying to build a legal justification to come after me." "But why?" she cried. "He has his money. He has more money than he ever would have gotten." "It was never about the money, Eliza." Kyle said, his voice low and intense. "It was about power. I took that from him. I showed him that his power was an illusion, that his gold was meaningless against a man who operates by a different set of rules. He cannot let that stand. He will use the law, the white man's law, to try and destroy what he cannot control." He looked out at the peaceful valley, his sanctuary. "He is starting a storm," Kyle said softly, "and he is going to try and aim it right at the heart of this canyon." The fragile peace was over. The world they had escaped was now coming for them. The idyllic peace of the valley was shattered. A quiet tension settled over the ranch, as tangible as the morning mist that clung to the river. Kyle's men became more vigilant, their eyes constantly scanning the high ridges that rimmed their hidden world. Riders were posted as lookouts at the secret entrance to the canyon, their silhouettes dark and watchful against the sky. The work of the ranch continued. Horses were trained, fields were tended, but an undercurrent of readiness hummed beneath every action. Eliza felt it keenly. The sanctuary had begun to feel like a gilded cage again, not because of Cale, but because of the world outside that sought to tear it down. She poured her anxiety into caring for Thomas. Under Narlin's skilled attention, he was making a remarkable recovery. The color was returning to his cheeks, and his appetite was growing. He was able to sit up in bed, and for the first time in nearly a year, Eliza heard him laugh, a weak, breathy sound, but a laugh nonetheless. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. Each day the bond between Eliza and Kyle deepened often, without a word being spoken. He would bring her a particularly beautiful wildflower he'd found on a ride, or leave a book of poetry on her doorstep, Shakespeare's sonnets. She, in turn, found herself watching for his return in the evenings, her heart giving a small, unfamiliar leap when she saw his powerful form riding across the valley floor. They were two outcasts, two survivors from different worlds who had found a common ground in this hidden place. The inevitable arrived on a hot, still afternoon, 2 weeks after Chaitan's warning. A single rider, One of the lookouts galloped into the ranch yard, his horse lathered in sweat. He spoke urgently to Cale, gesturing back toward the canyon entrance. Cale's face became a mask of stone. He turned to Eliza, who was on the porch of her cabin, her heart suddenly pounding. "Sheriff Brody is here," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "He has a posse of 10 men with him. Thorne is with them." Sheriff Brody. Eliza knew the name. He was a hard but generally fair man, a former Texas Ranger who valued order above all else. He was not a man easily swayed by gossip, which meant Thorne must have woven a very convincing web of lies. "What are you going to do?" Eliza asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Chayton and my men are already in position in the rocks above the trail. They will not be seen," Kyle explained. "A single foolish move from the posse would be their last. But I do not want bloodshed. It would only bring the army, and this valley would never know peace again. I will speak with him." He strode toward his stallion, which one of his men had already saddled. He checked the rifle in its scabbard and the pistol at his hip. "Stay in your cabin, Eliza, you and the boy. Do not come out no matter what you hear." "No," she said, surprising herself with the force of her own voice. She stepped off the porch and walked toward him. "Thorne's lies are about me. I will not hide while you face them for me. I am not a prize to be fought over. I am a witness." Kyle looked down at her, a flicker of protest in his eyes, but then he saw the iron resolve in her face. It was the same fire he had seen in her on the auction block in Redemption Gulch. To deny her, this would be to deny the very spirit he admired. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. "The boy?" he asked. "Nalin is with him. He's sleeping," she said. "I will stand with you." Together they rode toward the mouth of the canyon. As they neared the narrow entrance, they saw them. Sheriff Brody sat on his horse, a tall, gray-haired man with a weary face, his silver star glinting in the sun. Behind him were 10 deputized men from Redemption Gulch, their faces a mixture of grim determination and nervousness. And near the front, looking smug and triumphant, was Jedediah Thorne. When Thorne saw Eliza riding beside Cale alive and unharmed, his face contorted in a brief flash of surprise, quickly replaced by a mask of righteous fury. "There she is! Sheriff!" Thorne bellowed, pointing a fat finger. "You see, the savage has her. She's probably bewitched. Look at her dressed in those heathen moccasins." Sheriff Brody ignored Thorne's outburst. He raised a hand, signaling his posse to halt. His gaze was fixed on Kyle, acknowledging the unseen threat he knew must be lurking in the rocks around him. This was a parley, not a raid. "Kyle de la Cruz," Brody said, his voice steady. "I have a warrant sworn before a territorial judge. A complaint has been filed by Mr. Thorne here. He claims you abducted this woman, Eliza Abernathy, by threat and force." "And yet," Kyle replied, his voice calm and resonant, "she rides here with me of her own free will." "Does she look like a captive to you, Sheriff Kerr?" Brody's eyes shifted to Eliza. "Ma'am, are you here against your will? You can speak freely. The law is here to protect you." This was her moment. The fate of this valley of Cale, of her own future, rested on her next words. She urged her horse forward a few steps, so there was no question that she was speaking for herself. "Sheriff Brody," she began, her voice clear and strong, carrying in the still canyon air. "My name is Eliza Jane Abernathy. I am here of my own free will. The only man who has ever used threat and force against me is standing right behind you." She pointed a trembling but resolute finger at Jedediah Thorne. A murmur went through the posse. Thorne's face turned a mottled shade of purple. "She's lying. He's forced her to say this," Thorne screeched. I am not lying, Eliza continued, her voice rising with passion. Mr. Thorne declared my debt to him, a debt he himself inflated, and put my services up for public auction, because I refused to stop wearing trousers to do the labor he demanded of me. He shamed me in front of the entire town. Kyle de la Cruz did not abduct me. He paid $1,000 in gold to purchase my indenture contract from Mr. Thorne, an act every man in that crowd, and you yourself, Mr. Thorne, witnessed and accepted. The sheriff looked from Eliza's earnest, defiant face to Thorne's sputtering rage. A seed of doubt was clearly planted in the lawman's mind. $1,000? Brody asked, his eyes narrowing on Thorne. You told me he paid you $70 to cover her debt and then snatched her. The rest was a threat, a payment to keep me silent. Thorne blustered, sweat beading on his forehead. He's the liar, Sheriff, Eliza declared. He lied to you and to the judge because he was humiliated. He couldn't stand that a woman he considered his property found a protector, and that his protector was a man he despises out of prejudice and fear. Just then, a voice came from the back of the posse. She's telling the truth, Sheriff. All eyes turned to a lanky young man with a guilty expression. He was a cowhand named Billy, who often drank at Thorne's saloon. I was there, Billy said, refusing to look at Thorne. I saw the whole thing. The Apache threw down a bag of gold that nearly broke the porch. Thorne's eyes almost fell out of his head. He sold her fair and square, according to his own twisted auction. Thorne's face crumpled. You worthless drunk, I'll see you. That's enough, Thorne. Sheriff Brody said, his voice like cracking ice. His gaze shifted back to Cale, a new grudging respect in his eyes. He had been played for a fool his office used to settle a personal vendetta. It seems this warrant is based on a foundation of lies. But Thorne was not finished. His face was a mask of pure hatred. His hand, shaking with rage, darted toward the pistol at his belt. If the law won't deal with a savage, I will. He never had the chance. Before his fingers could even grasp the handle of his gun, an arrow seemingly from nowhere whistled through the air and embedded itself deep into the wooden pommel of his saddle inches from his hand. The fletching quivered violently. Thorne screamed, yanking his hand back as if he'd been burned. The men in the posse looked around in terror, their eyes scanning the silent, empty rocks above them. They were surrounded, hopelessly outmaneuvered. Kyle hadn't moved a muscle. He simply looked at Sheriff Brody. As I said, she is here of her own free will. Your business here is concluded, Sheriff. Take this trash back to town. Sheriff Brody stared at the arrow, then at Cale's unyielding face, and finally at Thorne, who was pale and trembling. He nodded slowly. He had seen enough. The law of the territory had just collided with the law of the canyon, and the canyon had won. Sheriff Brody was a pragmatic man. He understood power, and he understood when he was outmatched. The arrow in Thorne's saddle was not just a warning. It was a statement of absolute control. Kyle de la Cruz could have wiped out his entire posse without breaking a sweat, and Brody knew it. Disarm him, Brody ordered, jerking his chin at two of his men. They moved hesitantly, relieved to have a concrete order, and relieved it wasn't attack. They pulled Thorne's pistol from its holster and took his rifle. The saloon owner offered no resistance. The fight had completely drained out of him, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed fear. Thorne, you're under arrest, Brody declared, his voice ringing with disgust. For perjury, for filing a false report, and for wasting the time and resources of this office. You've made a fool of me, and I don't take kindly to that. But he's an Indian, Thorne whined, his last pathetic attempt to appeal to prejudice. You're taking his word over mine. No, Brody said, his voice cold. I'm taking the word of Miss Abernathy, and the word of Billy here, and the evidence of this arrow which tells me that Kyle de la Cruz has more honor and restraint than you've got in your entire greedy carcass. He turned his horse. "We're leaving." The posse turned eager to leave the oppressive silence of the canyon. They herded a whimpering Jedediah Thorne before them, his grand scheme of revenge having crumbled into his own personal ruin. Eliza watched them go, a profound sense of relief washing over her. She looked at Kyle, who had remained watchful and still throughout the entire ordeal. The tension slowly eased from his shoulders as the last of the riders disappeared from view. "It's over," she whispered. "For now." He corrected her, his gaze still on the canyon entrance. Men like Thorne have long memories, but his power in Redemption Gulch is broken. He will not be a threat again. They rode back to the ranch house in a thoughtful silence. The entire valley seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The lookouts returned from their hidden perches, their grim faces relaxing into smiles as they greeted Cale. They looked at Eliza with a newfound respect. She had not been a liability or a victim. She had been a warrior in her own right, fighting with truth as her weapon. That evening, a celebratory feast was held in the main ranch house. The long tables were laden with roasted venison corn squash and fresh bread baked in an adobe oven. The mood was joyous and light. Kyle's people, who had been reserved and watchful around Eliza, now included her in their conversations, smiling at her and offering her the choicest cuts of meat. She sat beside Cale, a plate of food untouched before her. The emotional exhaustion of the day was finally setting in. Thomas, fully recovered and brimming with a boyish energy she hadn't seen in years, was chattering happily with Chayton, who was showing him how to carve a small wooden horse. The sight brought a fresh wave of tears to Eliza's eyes. Kyle noticed. "You are not celebrating," he observed quietly. "I am," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's just, for so long all I've had is fear. Fear for Thomas. Fear of being alone. Fear of men like Thorne. I don't know how to live without it." "You learn," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You replace it with other things. Hope, peace. You build a life so strong that fear can find no cracks to get in." He paused, his dark eyes searching her face. "The contract you had with Thorne is null. My purchase of it was to free you, not to bind you. You are free to leave whenever you wish. I can give you enough money to travel to California to start a new life for you and your brother." His offer was everything she had once dreamed of. A new start, complete freedom safety for Thomas. But the thought of leaving the valley of leaving him sent a pang of desolation through her that was sharper than any fear she had ever known. She looked around the warm, bustling room, at the kind faces of Narlin and Chayton, at her healthy, smiling brother. She looked at the powerful, complex man beside her, the man who saw her strength when everyone else saw only her transgression. "What if I don't want to go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Cale's stoic mask finally broke. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, transforming his features and making him look younger, more vulnerable. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. "Then this is your home, Eliza Jane," he said. "Your work is no longer to fulfill a contract. Your work, if you choose to accept it, is to build a life here. With us. With me." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. His touch was warm and strong, a silent promise of everything to come. It was not the touch of an owner or a master, but of a partner, an equal. At that moment, a new truth settled in Eliza's soul. She had come to the West seeking survival, but she had found something far more profound. She had found a place where a woman in trousers was not a Jezebel, but a person of strength. She had found a home, not on a map, but in the heart of a hidden valley, and in the soul of a man who lived by a law written not in books, but on the heart. The reckoning of lies had ended, and the time for truth, the truth of a shared life, was just beginning. The seasons turned in the valley, washing away the memory of Redemption Gulch. Word eventually trickled back that Jedediah Thorne, disgraced and facing charges, had fled the territory a broken man. The threat was gone. In its place, the legend of the woman in trousers and the Apache who valued her honor began to soften the town's hard prejudices. Eliza's life transformed. She was no longer a guest, but part of the valley's heartbeat, learning the ways of the land from Narlin and Chayton. Thomas thrived, his cough replaced by the robust laughter of a healthy boy. The bond between Eliza and Kyle, forged in crisis, blossomed in the peace that followed. They became true partners. He shared with her the secrets of his world, from ancestral cliff dwellings to the careful stewardship of the land. In turn, she shared hers, reading him poetry and using her accounting skills to bring a new order to his trade records. He saw her mind was as strong as her spirit, and their evenings were spent in easy conversation on the veranda, two outcasts who had found a common language. One crisp autumn evening, as they stood on a bluff overlooking the moonlit valley, Kyle turned to her. "This is your home, Eliza," he said, his voice direct and serious. "But I want you to be my partner in more than just work. I want to build a life with you." It was not a flowery proposal, but a declaration between equals. Tears of joy filled Eliza's eyes. She thought of the woman who stood on an auction block, shamed for her defiance. Now she was being loved for it. "Yes, Kyle," she whispered. "Yes." He pulled her into his arms, and she knew the last vestiges of fear were gone forever. She was home. Their life together became the new legend of the valley. They managed the ranch as a team, a bridge between two cultures. Eliza never stopped wearing her trousers. They were no longer a symbol of rebellion, but of her identity, the mark of a woman who had faced down a hateful world and carved out a horizon of her own making beside the man who knew her spirit was never meant to be tamed. The story of Eliza Jane and Cale de la Cruz is more than just a tale of the Wild West. It's a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about conforming to the world's expectations, but about having the courage to defy them. It's about how the most unlikely of saviors can appear in our darkest moments, and how true partnerships are built, not on power and control, but on mutual respect and the recognition of a kindred spirit. They faced down prejudice, greed, and injustice, proving that honor and love can build a fortress stronger than any stone wall. What do you think was Kyle's intervention, an act of love or an act of defiance? Let us know in the comments below. If this story of courage and the fight for freedom moved you, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who loves a great story, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales from the forgotten corners of history.